That what a job. Let us just joyful noise and so much enthusiasm for this next storyteller, Kristen.
Yay, Kristen! Woo! Kristen! Yay! Got this! All right. I've known I wanted to be a clinical psychologist since I was 15 years old. This idea came to me as an epiphany in the middle of one January night in 2002. The next day, I was on my way to a psychiatric hospital, eager to help the patients there. On the way, I had a conversation with my grandmother, who was very supportive of my idea. When I arrived at the hospital, a nurse greeted me and showed me around, and I met some of the patients there, and I was so excited to get to work. It wasn't until I noticed the hospital bracelet around my wrist that I realized I was a patient. After a week coming down off a manic episode with psychosis, I was given the diagnosis of bipolar disorder and sent on my way. In wrapping my head around what this diagnosis meant, I learned everything I could about bipolar disorder. I went to several rounds of therapy. I went to a lot of school, and 15 years later, I became a clinical psychologist. My symptoms had been under control for so long that it felt like bipolar was a thing of the past. I had made it to the other side. But my life didn't feel complete. I knew I wanted to be a mother since I was a little girl, and this would have to force me to face that bipolar disorder again, because it meant that becoming a mother would come with some serious risks. I was at risk of shattering 15 years of stability with a relapse. I also had to consider the risk to the baby if I were to go off my medications. Even though the idea of having a relapse terrified me, I decided to go off my medication. My pregnancy was unremarkable. I felt like myself and thought maybe being off medication was going to work out just fine. In January of 2018, my husband Mike and I brought home a healthy baby boy. I was overjoyed and completely overwhelmed. Disorienting is a good way to describe what those first few weeks felt like. There were so many things to learn, like how to breastfeed and how to use a Moby wrap. There were so many things to keep track of for my physical recovery. There were so many hours of lost sleep, and all the while trying to take care of a helpless and demanding baby. So the most disorienting moments by far were those between sleep and wakefulness, when Mike would bring a screaming baby to my side and implore me to feed it. Mike says that I would talk with him for upwards of 30 minutes about some ridiculous things, like telling him to refill my running shoes with ink, and that I had this brilliant idea to plan a high school reunion because I had missed my own reunion. But things went from ridiculous to pretty scary when I told Mike that I had been talking to my grandmother on Facebook. My grandmother died when I was 13, and the last time I talked to her was when I was 15 years old, experiencing auditory hallucinations on the way to the psych hospital. On one particularly wild night of delusions and no sleep, things escalated to the point of me hitting Mike and yelling at him to get away from me. He called 911. With sirens blazing, the police, firefighters, and paramedics arrived at my house to find me writhing around on my living room floor, screaming incoherent things. Surrounding me were half a dozen family members and friends, trying gently to calm me down. One of the EMTs looked at them and asks, "Is she normally like this?" To which my friend Walter replied, "No, she's a doctor." The next thing I knew, I was being strapped to a gurney and carted off in an ambulance. I thought they were taking me to go meet up with friends across the country. Wouldn't that have been nice? But of course, the reality was that they were taking me to the psych hospital. When I came to and realized where I was filled with a deep sadness, anger, and shame. I was on the patient side again. Those feelings lingered with me some time after the hospital. But one day I realized I actually returned to the hospital on both sides. It was true that I was both a patient and a clinical psychologist. So in an unexpected way, I had kept my promise to myself. And my experience of postpartum psychosis helped me to realize that recovery from a mental illness is not a singular event. It's more like a journey. So it was possible to straddle the line between being a patient and a psychologist. And I'd like to believe that I did help some of the patients in the hospital with me, not as a psychologist and not as a patient, but as me. And both of those parts being integrated into who I am. I also realized that wellness is not the absence of psychiatric symptoms. Wellness is a choice. So regardless of whatever circumstances I'm going through, I can live a life worth living if I choose to respond to it in a positive way. My bipolar disorder will always be with me. My choice is to befriend it and to use it for good. Thank you.
Woo!
That was amazing.
Yeah.
Kristen.